Hey, howdy, friends. It's Steve DePoe here with the Rose Realty team again with this week's real estate vlog for North Texas. Today, who pays closing costs? Very interesting question, especially considering the last couple of years, right? So you're preparing to sell your home, and one of the most common and misunderstood questions we get is about closing costs and who pays them. Does the buyer pay them? Do you pay, as the seller, do you pay them? And how much are they going to be and how much is negotiable? I'm going to try to break down in the next couple of minutes what some of those closing costs are and who pays them in Denton County and what are concessions and how do concessions work. And then when we get to the closing table, we're all going to understand who pays what and like approximately how much it's going to be and all of that. Okay, so let's get into it. So the definition of a closing cost is just as it sounds, very easy. It's the costs that have accumulated over the course of the transaction, usually around 21 to 30 days, right? And those are the costs that accumulate on both sides. And who ends up paying those costs? Well, there's a group of costs that the seller is going to pay, or rather accumulates, which is potentially title insurance, some transaction fees. If you're a part of an HOA, it's going to be potentially some gathering of HOA documents and certificates. Okay. And on the buyer side, there's going to be appraisal fees. There's going to be background checks. There's also going to be um, the credit rating scores. They're going to have to gather those, and there's going to be fees on the buyer side, right? It's important to understand that there's fees on both sides, and it's also important to understand um, who pays what fees when you're accepting an offer on a house. And usually the buyer's agent, okay, will put a offer out there, you may want to call it, during the contract period about who's going to pay what fees and what fees the buyer would like the seller to pay, etc. Right? So the novel view of these fees and kind of like I'm not going to say tradition, but I'm going to say what are the sort of like best practices and who pays what. Okay, so buyer fees versus seller fees. So like I just mentioned, they're going to be not only background checks, but there's going to be appraisal fees that the buyer is going to pay. There's going to be credit rating scores, which is going to be part of the mortgage. Okay, there's going to be on the seller side there could potentially be HOA fees and HOA certificates, the tax assessment, appraisal fee of the house, maybe, etc., and title insurance. Okay. Now, what's negotiable and what's typical? Well, usually what happens at this point is the seller will pay their fees, okay, and the buyer will pay their fees, but certain things like appraisal fee and title insurance and potentially some HOA fees or somewhat negotiable and somewhat concessionable. Okay, and it depends on who, depending on who sort of you may want to call it who has the upper hand in the transaction is depending on who's going to pay some of those fees. So, what are concessions? What are examples of buyer requests for help? And how are concessions offered during negotiations? So let's talk about some HOA fees as an example, okay? In some communities, there's sort of, I want to call it a buy-in to that community where the buyer will pay a certain fee in order to move into the community. So here at Robson Ranch, we call that a CIF, a Community Improvement Fund fee, and that's going to be charged to the buyer of the property only on resale. And that's going to be a fee that's going to be charged to the buyer. Now, there has been instances where the seller has ended up paying that fee. Now, there's been times when I've been the buyer's agent and the seller's agent didn't know those fees existed. And I said, hey, my buyer wants the seller to pay the SIF fee. The seller's agent didn't even know that they existed, and they ended up paying him, thereby saving my client about $3,500. Okay. Um, the title insurance. Title insurance is somewhat of a funny fee or insurance, but it's to make sure that the owner of the house or the seller owns the house free and clear. That's usually a fixed percentage of the selling price of the house. And usually the seller likes the buyer to pay that title insurance. I happen to be one on the buyer side that feels that that should be a buyer concession or a buyer fee that they pay because after all, they've lived in the house. They know whether they own the house free and clear, and it shouldn't be up to the buyer to say to the seller, hey, I'm going to ensure you that you don't owe any big bucks to somebody else. That's something that's usually kind of splittable. Or concessionable, so that if the buyer wants the seller to pay that fee, they can throw it out there, and then the two agents kind of negotiate with obviously the input of their clients, who's going to end up paying that fee. Now, if the that SIF that I mentioned and the title insurance ends up being, let's say, on the seller side, then what can happen during closing is they can take the price those costs off the top of the price of the house. And then when the buyer comes to closing with either a check or money from a lender, that'll just be, subtracted out, and it'll be less that they owe like on their mortgage, or that they owe in cash if they're a cash buyer. Very seldom, if ever, does the seller end up cutting a check and giving it to the buyer. That might be that might be might take place during some repair type of things that are negotiated. Hey, the seller's going to give the buyer, $500 to repair the whatever, the blah blah blah, because they weren't able to do it before closing. And then we would hope that the buyer would stick that money in his pocket, get that thing fixed, and then, take that cash back and get that thing fixed so that, it's not continually broken. But concessions are usually handled at closing and taken off the price, or the amount that the buyer has to bring to the closing table in order to complete the transaction. Now, a lot of this will depend on what type of market we're in. So in like 2021, for example, it was a hot market. It was definitely a seller's market. And so there was, number one, very few concessions on the seller side. It was usually all on the buyer side. So the buyer, didn't do an inspection, didn't ask for repairs, paid every fee known to man. And again, the concessions were then put on the buyer, you might want to call it. So where the buyer ended up paying the agreed to price plus all these concessions and all these fees. In a more of a balanced market, so let me change course. In a buyer's market, then the seller will more often say, "Hey, it's a buyer's market. We've got a live one here. Let's give them concessions on fees and taxes and title insurance and whatever, so that we don't lose them." And on a more of a balanced market, there's more negotiating, there's more give and take on both ends to make sure that the buyer gets the house they want and the seller ends up, now that they have somebody kind of who likes the house or wants to buy it, then the seller doesn't want to lose them, and so they might negotiate or have some concessions on their side in order to make sure that that buyer sticks with the house and doesn't end up walking to someplace else. Strategic responses, and net impact. So, like I said, so you would adjust the price of the house at closing, to compensate for those concessions, right? Eventually, what happens is that comes off maybe the mortgage, comes off with the mortgage, and it depends on like I said, it depends on the market at that point. But it would come off the mortgage, and your seller's agent or your listing agent would then do a net sheet for you to determine, what your net proceeds are going to be. So it's kind of tough to say, hey, we've got $600,000 floating around, and we're going to give them this, we're going to give this back and give this back and give this back. Well, geez, what am I left with? So your agent, the selling agent, should do a net sheet to tell you, as the seller of the house, here's what you're going to walk away with after, after after concessions, and maybe after commissions and those kinds of things. Here's what you're going to walk away with, and it's still more than than you thought, since you think you're giving away the farm, more or less. So in summary, working with a local expert is going to be real important at this point, because the local expert's going to know what the market is and what the generally accepted practices are. I mentioned to you, that one client I had where the selling agent didn't know about the community improvement fund, and so I wrote into the contract that the seller's going to pay that. Okay, because he didn't even know about it, because he was not from here. He was from mid or southern Texas, and so I think he was related to the sellers, if I'm not mistaken. And so, hey, I did my responsibility in taking care of my clients to make sure that they were happy, and they got as much back as they could. Okay, and then the seller ended up paying that fee. That's where a local agent, who understands, number one, the local market, and understands local, like, tradition and concessions and local fees that apply. Because normally what will happen is, when, for example, a community improvement fund, we list that on MLS in the listing. Okay, and so the people know, bam, the buyer's going to have to pay that. Okay, there's negotiating and concessions, of course. He didn't even list it. He didn't even know. And so I have my clients take advantage of that. Okay. Um, Getting back to the summary, we'll run down the net sheet for you. We'll explain the cost breakdown. Usually 3 days or so before closing, you'll get what's called a net sheet from the title company, and we'll go through that line by line, so that you understand, hey, this is a $5 fee for this, and this is a transportation fee, and this is a this and that, a courier fee. And then so you just don't think you're being nickel and dime to death. Most of these fees, FYI, in Texas are set. Okay, there's the title insurance is set, and a lot of these other fees are set. So it doesn't matter whether you're going to title company A or title company B, they're going to be the same price. Okay, it depends on the competency of those title companies and how confident your agent is in that title company to know whether we're going to get a competent closing, or whether it's going to be just a mess at the end of the day. Okay, and so there's a real advantage of working with a local agent that understands the market and understands the traditions in that particular market and that particular area, and they're not from, someplace else. I hope that kind of helped. There's much more to it than that, but I kind of on a time limit there. Next week, we're going to talk about building wealth through real estate. So real estate is one of the best ways to build generational wealth for your family. We're going to dive into how to start the process of building generational wealth and how to keep it going. That will then benefit. Like the term says, generations, the current generation, and then future generations on down the line. This is Steve. I am with the Rose Realty team. Until next week.